We use it every single day. But it's easy to take the English language for granted. Have you ever thought about traveling back in time and hearing how it sounded centuries ago?
I think a lot of people would be shocked to hear how much English has changed over time.
That's what we're doing in this deep dive. We're going on a 1,500-year journey through the evolution of English pronunciation.
Buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride.
You've probably wondered why the spelling of some English words is so different from how they sound.
Yeah, English spelling can be a nightmare.
We're going to look at how that happened. And maybe you've heard Shakespeare performed in original pronunciation.
That can really throw people off.
It makes you realize that Shakespeare actually sounded really different than we usually imagine.
It definitely makes those plays hit differently.
Those are the kinds of mysteries we're going to be uncovering today.
We're going to start with Old English. Like, way back to the 5th century AD, that's when the Anglo-Saxons were arriving in Britain.
So that's going to sound super different to us.
Oh, yeah. Most people would have no idea what they were hearing.
We're going to go all the way from those sounds of Old English up to the modern day.
English has spread so far. There's an incredible diversity of accents in modern English.
I always find that amazing.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
On this deep dive, we're going to figure out how English pronunciation has morphed over centuries and centuries.
It's wild to think about how a language can change that much.
Exactly. It's a huge transformation.
Yeah.
It shows you how much language is alive and how much can change.
You might think about language as this fixed thing. Like, it's all written down in a dictionary.
Right.
But that's only part of the story. When you think about how people actually speak, it's totally different. Pronunciation has been in constant flux.
Okay, so we're going way back in time. Let's rewind back to the beginning. We're going to start with Old English.
Like I was saying, this is the language that the Anglo-Saxons spoke.
After they got to Britain
Yeah.
around the 5th century. So you might think that it would be kind of like an older version of modern English.
It's just a little more formal.
Yeah, exactly. But it was actually incredibly different from modern English.
It's really true. If you could listen to a conversation in Old English, it would sound super foreign to you.
So what would make it sound so weird to modern ears? What kinds of sounds did Old English have that we don't have now?
Well, one example is that guttural ish sound. It's like the she in the Scottish word loch.
I've heard that. It's in the back of your throat.
Exactly. And that sound was really common in Old English.
Okay, so that's one big difference. Any others?
They also had a rolled R, like in Spanish or Italian. So every time they said an R, it would be trilled.
So picture all of that, those sounds in every sentence. That would make Old English sound so different.
Totally. Just imagine someone walking down the street talking like that.
Okay, so let's take a specific example so we can really hear how different it would sound.
Sounds good.
So there's a word in modern English that we all know,
Yep.
night. But in Old English, it was spelled sea-night. And it wasn't pronounced night like we say it now.
No, in Old English, it would have been pronounced more like ku-nicht.
So that K sound is pronounced, and then the C has that guttural sound.
Exactly. So different from how we say night now.
So it would have sounded like a totally different language.
It basically was a different language. It was way more closely related to other Germanic languages like German or Dutch. That's where all of its sounds and grammar came from.
That makes sense.
Good.
Old English was basically a Germanic language. It sounded more like German to our ears.
Yeah. If you were thrown back in time to an Old English-speaking area, you would not understand anything.
Okay, so let's jump forward a few hundred years.
Let's do it.
We're going from Old English to Middle English.
That's right. Roughly from 1100 to 1500 AD.
Well, so this is the time of Chaucer.
Yes. He wrote the Canterbury Tales in Middle English.
You might have read that in school.
A lot of people do.
So things are starting to change in Middle English, both in society and in how people are speaking.
That's right. Things are starting to sound a bit more like modern English.
So what were the big changes that were happening in pronunciation during that time?
Well, one really important event that shaped Middle English pronunciation was the Norman Conquest.
That was in 1066.
Yep. When the Normans, who spoke French, conquered England.
Right.
So that had a huge impact on English pronunciation.
Yeah.
It led to a softening of some of the sounds from Old English.
Like that hard K sound in snite.
Aye, that sound started to disappear. It was the beginning of the journey toward the silent K in night.
Okay, so that's one big change. The hard K starts to become silent because of French influence.
Yes.
But there's another big development in English pronunciation that hadn't really happened yet in Middle English.
You're right. The Great Vowel Shift, that was still coming.
And that was a massive change.
It totally changed how English sounded.
So what were vowel sounds like in Middle English before the Great Vowel Shift happened?
Well, the vowels in Middle English would probably sound a bit more familiar if you've ever heard modern Italian or Spanish. Interesting.
The vowels were pronounced in a very pure way, without a lot of the gliding sounds that we have in English today.
So can you give us an example so we can really hear the difference?
Sure. Let's use that famous line from the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. One that April with his shearer's soot. Okay, everyone knows that line. So how would that have actually sounded in Middle English?
It would sound something like this. One that April, with his shoeressa too.
Wow, that does sound really different. So how come April sounds like that?
It's because the A in April would have been a long A sound, like in the modern word father.
Oh, okay, I hear it. And what about suit? Why does that sound so weird?
Well, suit would have had a very pure oo sound, very different from the vowel sound in the modern word suit.
Right, it sounds like a mix of suit and soot.
Yeah, kind of. So even though the words themselves might look familiar on the page, the way that they were spoken back then was totally different.
So even though Middle English might be easier to read than Old English, it would still sound very different to us.
It would, for sure. But Middle English was kind of a bridge between Old English and early modern English.
So it's like we're seeing the foundations of modern English starting to be put into place.
Exactly. Middle English was a transition phase.
So now we come to a truly huge event in the history of English pronunciation, the Great Vowel Shift.
That's right. This is a big one.
This happened between 1400 and 1700 AD.
It was a really important period.
So the name itself, the Great Vowel Shift, it sounds pretty major. What actually happened?
Well, during the Great Vowel Shift, the long vowel sounds in English started to be pronounced differently. They basically shifted upward in the mouth.
So the position of your tongue changes.
Yes, the way that people were making those vowel sounds changed.
Interesting. Can you give us an example?
Yeah. Think about the word bite.
Okay.
Before the Great Vowel Shift, bite would have sounded more like beat.
What, beat and bite sounded the same?
Well, not exactly the same, but very similar.
Wow. Okay, so bite sounded more like beat. That is a big change.
It is a huge change. And it affected a lot of words.
So that begs the question, what caused this massive change in pronunciation?
That's a really good question. And linguists are still debating that.
No easy answer.
No, not really. But one of the most common theories is that it happened because of big social changes that were going on at the time.
So what kinds of changes are we talking about?
Well, one big one was the Black Death. That was a plague that killed a ton of people in Europe.
Right.
And after the Black Death, there was a rise of the middle class.
Okay, so society's being restructured.
Yes. And that might have led to changes in how people spoke.
That's fascinating. So these huge societal changes could have had a direct impact on how people were pronouncing vowel sounds.
Exactly. It's kind of mind-blowing.
And you mentioned earlier that the Great Vowel Shift is one of the big reasons why English spelling doesn't always match how words are pronounced.
That's right.
So how'd that happen?
Well, during the Middle English period, English spelling was starting to become more standardized.
So people were starting to agree on how to spell things.
Right. But then the Great Vowel Shift happened.
And that messed everything up.
Kind of, yeah. The problem was that the vowel shift happened after a lot of those spellings were already fixed.
Oh, so people kept spelling words the old way, even though they were pronouncing them differently.
Exactly. So even though the way that people pronounced words was changing a lot, the written forms of the words often didn't change to reflect those changes.
That's why we have words like through and tough and though.
Yeah, those words all have the same letters.
But they sound totally different.
Right. That's because those spellings reflect an older pronunciation from before the Great Vowel Shift was finished.
So it's like the spellings got frozen in time while pronunciation kept changing.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so the Great Vowel Shift was a huge deal.
Huge.
It changed English pronunciation in a really big way. And it's one of the main reasons why we have so many weird spellings in English.
Exactly.
And it also made English sound more like the English that we speak today.
Right. After the Great Vowel Shift, English started to sound much more familiar to modern ears.
Okay, so we've made it through Old English and Middle English and the Great Vowel Shift.
What a journey.
So now we're in early modern English.
That's right. The period from about 1500 to 1700 AD.
So this is the time of Shakespeare.
And the King James Bible.
So by this point, English must have been sounding pretty close to modern English, right?
It was getting there. It was much closer to how we speak today, but there were still some differences.
What kinds of differences?
Well, one difference is that people were still pronouncing the R sound at the end of words.
Also, like in British English today?
No, actually, this was different. Back then, almost everyone pronounced that R sound, no matter where they were from.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that in Shakespeare's time, people would have pronounced words like car and father with a strong R at the end.
Exactly. It's called rhoticity, when the R is always pronounced.
Okay, so that's one difference. And you said that some of the vowel sounds were still changing.
That's right. Some of those vowel shifts from the Great Vowel Shift were still happening.
What kind of evidence do we have for that?
Well, we can look at the way that Shakespeare rhymed words in his plays.
Oh, interesting.
For example, he rhymed words like love and move.
We don't rhyme those words now.
No, we don't. So that tells us that the vowel sound in love was probably different back then.
It probably sounded more like move.
Exactly. And the word T was probably pronounced more like te.
Tay.
Yep, just like it sounds. So there were still some subtle but noticeable differences in pronunciation.
It's like a different dialect of modern English, like a version with a few little twists.
Yeah.
And this leads us to Shakespeare's original pronunciation. What is that?
So original pronunciation is basically an attempt to figure out exactly how English was spoken in Shakespeare's time.
So we can hear Shakespeare the way that his audience would have heard him.
Right. And we do that by studying old texts and looking at how spellings varied, and also by studying rhymes and poetry from that time period.
So there's a lot of detective work.
It is. But we've learned a lot. We have a pretty good idea of how Shakespeare's plays would have sounded to his audience.
And when you hear those plays performed in original pronunciation, it's a really different experience.
It is. You start to hear all these puns and wordplay that you might not have noticed before.
Because the sounds of the words have changed so much.
Exactly.
It's like you're hearing the plays with fresh ears.
It is. And it helps you understand the plays in a whole new way.
And it gives you a deeper understanding of the language itself and the culture of that time.
That's right. Original pronunciation is a really valuable tool for anyone who wants to understand Shakespeare.
Okay, so we've come to the final stage of our journey, modern English, from about 1700 to the present day.
The English we all speak and hear every day.
Exactly. And this is where things get really diverse.
That's right. Modern English has an incredible variety of accents.
It's amazing to think about how English has spread around the world.
It is. English has become a global language.
And as it's spread, it's encountered all these different cultures.
And different languages.
And that's led to the evolution of all these different accents.
Precisely. And each accent has its own unique history and its own unique sound.
So just think about how different a British accent sounds from an American accent.
Or an Australian accent.
Or a South African accent.
Right. They all come from the same root, but they've branched off in all these different directions.
It's a beautiful thing. It shows you how much a language can change and adapt.
It really does.
And even within those big categories, there are so many regional and social variations.
So many. It's almost impossible to keep track of them all.
And you said earlier that pronunciation is always changing.
Always. It never stops.
So even in our lifetime, English pronunciation is changing.
Yep, it's happening right now.
What are some examples of those changes?
Well, one example is that R at the end of words.
You were talking about that earlier with rotifity.
Right. So in a lot of British accents, that R sound has become silent, unless the next word starts with a vowel.
So a British person might say car without pronouncing the R, but they would pronounce it in car alarm.
Exactly. And that's different from most American accents where that R is usually pronounced.
That's called non-roticity.
That's right.
And that's a change that's still happening today.
Yep. It's an ongoing process.
So English is always evolving, even now in the 21st century.
That's right.
So this brings up a really basic question. Why does pronunciation keep changing? It seems like it would be easier if it just stayed the same.
It would be simpler in a way, but the truth is that language is a social tool.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that we use language to communicate with each other, but we also use it to signal who we are and where we come from.
So our pronunciation can tell people something about us.
Exactly. And that's one of the big reasons why pronunciation changes, because people are constantly trying to fit in or to stand out.
Okay, so social pressure can change pronunciation.
It's a huge factor, and sometimes those changes are conscious.
Like we might try to sound more like our friends.
Right. Or we might try to sound more professional in a work setting.
Or we might try to sound more casual when we're hanging out with people we're close to.
Exactly. But sometimes those changes are unconscious.
So we don't even realize that we're changing our pronunciation.
That's right. It just happens naturally as we interact with other people.
So that's one reason why pronunciation changes, because of social pressure.
Right. And another big reason is geography.
Okay.
When English spreads to a new part of the world, it encounters new languages and new cultures.
And those languages and cultures can influence the way that English is pronounced.
Exactly. So you get all these regional variations.
That's why American English and Australian English sound so different.
That's right, because they developed in isolation from each other.
And then in recent times, we've had technology and media.
Those have been huge factors in language change.
So things like movies and TV and the internet.
Right. They expose us to all sorts of different accents.
And we start to pick up those accents.
It's true. And it happens subconsciously.
So our pronunciation is constantly being influenced by all these different sources.
Exactly. And that's why pronunciation is always changing. Because language is a living thing. It's constantly adapting to the needs of its speakers.
Well, that was a really amazing journey.
I thought so too.
We've come a long way from the guttural sounds of Old English to the incredible diversity of accents in modern English.
It's been quite a ride.
We've seen how big historical events like the Norman Conquest and the Great Vowel Shift have shaped English pronunciation.
And we've talked about why English spelling is so weird.
And we've seen how English is still changing today, thanks to social factors and geographical differences and the influence of technology.
It's fascinating to see how much a language can change over time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. What will English sound like in another 500 years?
What a great question.
What factors will drive those future changes in pronunciation? Will technology play an even bigger role? Will some accents become more dominant than others?
Those are all really interesting questions, and I don't think anyone knows the answers for sure, but I think it's safe to say that English will continue to evolve.
It's like gazing into a crystal ball.
It really is.
We can only imagine what the future of English pronunciation holds.
I can't wait to find out.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the evolution of English pronunciation.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope you've enjoyed learning about the history of your language. Until next time, keep listening and keep exploring the amazing world of language.
It's a world full of surprises.
It sure is.